Well, this is Charlie. Thank you very much for listening to the Culture Bumpkin podcast, where I, as the irrevocable redcoat, have tried to impart some British military history on the uncultured colonial barbarians over the pond.
Very good. Thank you, brother. All right.
You're listening to The Cultured Bumpkin, a literature podcast with Jake Phillips, where we present audiobook quality readings of the classics for your enjoyment. Thank you for stopping by. And remember, just because you're a bumpkin doesn't mean you can't be cultured.
I'll let you introduce yourself.
So I'm Charlie. So I'm a research assistant and for history books. We're working on one now, and we've done one on D-Day with my esteemed boss, Geraint Jones. I've got connection with the British military, and so as a result, I've got a very heavy interest, particularly in cavalry history and all kinds of military history and British military history. It's been rather interesting being here. It's my first time in the States to have the children asking, why is there a red coat in people's houses? But I've enjoyed it, so very interested to talk about my various laborious opinions on things.
Excellent. So I love British stuff, English stuff. Take it away, Charlie.
Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. All in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward, the Light Brigade! Charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward, the Light Brigade! Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to the left of them, cannon to the right of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode, and well, into the jaws of death. Into the mouth of hell rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there. Charging an army while all the world pondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke, Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke. Shattered and sundered, they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed it with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death. Back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made. All the world wondered. Honour the charge they made. Honour the Light Brigade. Noble 600.
Outstanding. Tell us what you know.
So the Light Brigade, they charged fatefully in what was called the Battle of Balaclava. To know about that, it was part of the Crimean War, which is, I think, a very good example of the type of warfare Britain engaged in the 19th century. So Britain, after the Napoleonic Wars, was the preeminent power in Europe and the world. We had defeated the French, our only major rival on the continent, but most importantly in the seas and at large. We had a complete dominance in the colonies. I say we. I wish I could have been one of those people, but sadly I am confined to the modern era. But Britain, after winning the Battle of Trafalgar, had complete dominance over the seas. And then after winning the Napoleonic Wars, they had free reign to colonize and expand their influence across the world. Our main focus was India, but there were all other kinds of colonies, from the Caribbean to South Africa to Malaya, Hong Kong, everywhere. And as a result of this, we tried quite a lot to stay out of European affairs, because something like the Napoleonic Wars was especially costly for relatively little gain compared to what we could gain if we went to fight a war against people who weren't so good at fighting back in the colonies. And the linchpin to our colonies, specifically India, was the Suez Canal. The canal just west of the Sinai Desert in Egypt, which, with a co-French effort, we had built prior to the Crimean War. And we were rather concerned that Russian expansion southwards towards the Ottoman Empire would compromise our supply routes towards India. Russia had been a key concern for us in India since the 2 decades or more before the Crimean War, where we were competing for influence with them in Central Asia, primarily Afghanistan, where we had fought, I believe in 1841, a disastrous campaign where we had invaded Afghanistan to try and deny that to the Russians and had been pushed out of Kabul on a pretty disastrous march on a retreat to the Khyber Pass in 1841. And the key to this is that we wanted to make sure that Russia didn't have the ability to compromise our supply line to India. And so with the weakening Ottoman Empire, which was starting to, at this point, to become the sick man of Europe, they were trying desperately to cling on to their possessions in Bulgaria and Serbia and Greece, and they were not developing as quickly as the other continental European powers were. And Russia was taking full advantage of this. Since Catherine the Great, they had been trying to seize Constantinople, now Istanbul, and the Crimean War was a point where Russia had seen the weakness of the Ottoman Empire, and they declared war on them.
When was Catherine the Great's reign?
I believe that was in the late 1700s. Rumoured to have had less than PG relations with a horse. Whether or not that's true, we're not sure. But she was quite a prominent figure in Russian centralization and foreign policy. She was a very, very important figure for them. But so the Russians had declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Their primary aim for this war was to seize what was known as the Danubian Principalities. The Danube being one of the most major rivers in southeastern Europe that goes through the Balkans. And the Danubian Principalities were the parts of the Balkans under Ottoman control, primarily now modern Romania and Bulgaria. And the Russians had tried to invade through the Balkans, and it was disastrous. They were quite sorely whipped by the Ottomans. But also, it wasn't just that. Austria, at this time, was not Austria-Hungary, just Austria, had threatened, although previously at least neutral, if not somewhat allied towards Russia, under pressure from Britain and France, had threatened to invade, or not invade, but counter the Russian thrust southwest. And so, as a result of this and their sore defeats to the Ottomans, they withdrew from the Danubian Principalities. At this point, France and Britain had declared war on Russia because we didn't want to allow the Russians to defeat the Ottomans sorely and then expand southwards. Although the Ottomans were by no means our ally, we wanted to ensure that they were strong enough to resist Russian incursions south. I think the justification for this was the Russians had claimed that they were invading the Ottomans to protect Christians in the Levant region, nowadays Israel and Lebanon.
And what is, as far as Ottoman, what would that be now? What region would that be now?
That would be Israel and Lebanon now, the sort of western coast of the Middle East.
The Ottoman Empire?
Yeah, the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire at large went from what is now modern-day Bosnia all the way to Libya and Kuwait. They were a very large empire at the time, but they were an empire of the 17th century when they're at their height in, say, 1683 at the Siege of Vienna. By the mid-19th century, they were struggling. They had refused to reform, and they were just not competitive with the other major European powers at the time. And so, under the guise of protecting Orthodox Christians in the Levant region, the Russians invaded the Ottoman Empire. Everyone knew it was because they wanted to seize Constantinople, basically. And so Britain and France didn't allow this. Bearing in mind, we had been fighting against the French as our primary enemy for centuries prior, and that reached its climax at the Battle of Waterloo. Funny anecdote is Lord Raglan, the commander of the British forces in the Crimean War, is what it later became, was known to, in his camp, keep a wary eye on the French camp just nearby, because in his mind, having fought in the Napoleonic Wars under Wellington, well, not fought, he was a staff officer, but he was remarked to have constantly been keeping a wary eye on the French, because in his mind they were still the true enemy. Nevertheless, so once the Russians had been soundly kicked out of the Danubian principalities, this Franco-British army arrived in Varna, now modern-day Bulgaria, and there was this sort of, what do we do now? Even before they went to Varna, the British government had declared war on Russia without knowing what to do. There was a debate of, should we invade through the Baltic into St. Petersburg? How are we going to fight this war? And with the Danubian campaign going ahead, that was where we decided to send our troops. But after the Russians had been soundly whipped from the Danubian principalities and our army was suffering from disease in Varna, it was the idea of something had to be done. And so where did we go? The nearest major Russian port to where we were, which is now Crimea on the Black Sea. Our target was Sevastopol. And to reach that, we did a landing on a beach, not a port, and it took far longer than expected. I can't exactly remember how long it took, but it took a number of days just for the army to disembark from their ships.
And this is when?
1854, I believe. Okay. It took a number of days to disembark from the ships and organise on the beachhead. It was fortunately unopposed. If it had been, it might have been a lot more disastrous. But this was the start. Well, not the official start, but the sort of operational start of the Crimean War. We advanced towards Sevastopol, the main port on the Crimean Peninsula, and we fought the Battle of Alma, which was a costly yet effective victory, where over the River Alma we advanced against the Russian forces and forced them from their positions. And this is the first bit that really relates to the Battle of Balaclava. The reason why it wasn't a massive success was because although our infantry had been triumphant, although it was rather costly, we didn't pursue them with cavalry, which is normally how in the 19th century and late 18th century that a battle was really won. Once the enemy had been routed, as the Americans would say, it was the cavalry that would mop up these disorganized survivors and cut them down in their droves, and that would be where the majority of casualties would be incurred. But Lord Lucan, known as Lord Lookon after the Battle of Alma, didn't take the initiative. It was the job of a cavalry commander to take their own initiative, and when they see an opportunity for them to use their cavalry, it was best left up to them to seize that moment and charge or do whatever they thought best to seize the opportunity without having to wait however long it would take for a commander to send them an explicit order to charge. Of course, some, like Marshal Ney at Waterloo, took this way too far, but when cavalry worked best, it was a commander well understanding his commander's intent and proactively executing that action. So at the Battle of Alma, Lucan didn't proactively use his cavalry, and they stood idle at the Battle of Alma. It was the guards and other infantry that, utilising their new Enfield rifles, outranged and outbayoneted the Russian troops, fighting a dogged advance up a very steep hill to defeat the Russians there. After we won the Battle of Alma, we then marched towards Sevastopol. We enveloped it from north to south and had acquired ports that I think it was called Kamenchi, something like that, and Balaclava. Now, the Russians saw that Balaclava was one of the linchpins to our supply lines for the siege of Sevastopol, and so they enacted a offensive action against Balaclava to try and dislodge our supply lines.
What year are we up to?
Still 1854.
Okay.
I think it was September. I could be wrong, but it was still in 1854.
So for the for a little American context, because we're always the center of attention. I'm just kidding. I was in the 1st U.S. Cavalry, which would later reflag to the 4th in the American Civil War. Excuse me. 1854 was our first engagement out on the plains on the North Fork of the Solomon River against the Northern Cheyenne, which later fought at the Battle of Little Bighorn, one of the Confederated tribes that defeated Custer up in southern Montana. 1854. John Brown was about to kind of rise to prominence, the abolitionist, and then the war drums of, Civil War was brewing in in the United States during this time. All the while, back in Balaclava.
Yeah, so back in Balaclava, the British forces were, and French, I forget about our froggy cousins from across the channel. Well, we don't really care about them. Yeah, so the true enemy and us had just enveloped Sevastopol. We were digging in for a long, prolonged siege of the city. And so the Russians saw that Balaclava was a key supply port for our siege lines. And so they enacted a southern thrust to try and capture Balaclava and dislodge us. Now, the Turks, or the Ottomans, were also our allies in this war. Not very effective ones, I might add, because at the start of the Battle of Balaclava, we had entrusted the Turks with some artillery pieces and put them in place on the heights of Balaclava, just outside the city. And they were sitting in these redoubts, and when the Russians came, they put up a bit of a defense, but the Russian Cossack cavalry quickly overran these forts. And as a result of this, Raglan had seen what was happening, and he was sitting perched on a hill on what I think was called the Soporn Heights. As the Russian Cossacks had overrun these forts, eventually, several hours later, they began to charge in a sudden thrust towards Balaclava. Standing between them and the city was the 92nd Highlanders. Big, burly Scottish men wearing kilts, armed with little else than a musket and hate for the enemy. And so normally...
Claymores out of fashion.
As cool as they would have been, yes, claymores were no longer used.
It was like Culloden was the last time they were sort of used.
Yeah. Claymores were... Yeah. Claymores were a large, two-handed medieval sword. Sadly, as cool as it would have been, not in use in the 19th century.
Use them
Ceremonially, no. They were armed with rifles and bayonets, and the officers with broadswords. So, traditionally in 19th century and late 18th century warfare, infantry could adopt multiple formations that would most benefit them for the situation they found themselves in. So they would adopt a 2-deep or 3-rank-deep line when facing infantry, because this meant that they had the most amount of muskets or rifles facing the enemy as possible. However, the drawback to this was they were not very deep. And as a result of that, if they were caught off guard by a large cavalry charge, the cavalry could punch through this line, through them, and exploit around the back and cause havoc. Normally, that would be the case. To counter cavalry, the most normal doctrine was to adopt a square formation, where they would adopt, a square formation that would be many ranks deep, such that if a cavalry charge tried to punch through it, they would be fought back by bayonets and musket balls, as is exactly what happened against Ney's cavalry charge at Waterloo, when we soundly whipped the true enemy, that is the French, when they tried in vain to charge over a hill. Yeah. But at Balaclava, the colonel in command of the 92nd Highlanders didn't have enough time to reform into a square, and he relied on Scottish courage and the improved range of their new Enfield rifles to soundly defeat this Russian Cossack cavalry charge.
Excuse me, that would have been the same time, I don't know what year model it would have been, the Enfield, but the Confederate states in the American Civil War used a lot of Enfield rifles, as opposed to the Springfield of the Union. The southern states imported a lot of Enfields from the British. So that probably was a similar rifle.
I'd imagine it would be
probably the same one.
I'd imagine it's similar or the same one,
Yeah.
There was an interesting thing at Alma. Part of the reason why we had so many casualties was because commanders had never used these rifles before, and they were drilled and trained in sort of Napoleonic tactics and sort of their standard distances of engagement, and so were employing their troops. Bearing in mind, the Russians had still smoothbore muskets, so the Russian infantry at the Battle of the Alma and in the Crimean War were very similarly equipped as they would have been in the Napoleonic Wars, whereas ours had this new rifle, which had a much greater effective range than a smoothbore musket, but commanders in this battle didn't really know the effectiveness of it, and so they employed their troops as if they would have been in 1815. They could have basically just stood a lot further back, enjoyed their standoff distance or just greater engagement distance, and peppered the Russians while musket balls would have fallen at their feet. But they just hadn't used them before, and so sent them up on a close engagement and then bayonet charge, which resulted in a lot of casualties. I think it was something like the Russians suffered 4,500 casualties and we suffered like 3,800 at Alma. But anyway, back to Balaclava. The 92nd Highlanders, despite all doctrinal thinking, managed to bravely fight off this Russian cavalry charge. The Cossacks, they were forced back and did not break it. There is a fantastic painting of it. This is where the phrase thin red line comes from, because it's referring to the thin, being their 2 or 3 ranks deep, line of Scottish Highlanders. And that's actually a bit of a Mandela effect, because the quote isn't thin red line, it's thin red streak. As I can't remember the name of him, but a reporter, that's what he wrote for the Times, being a thin red streak of bayonets and steel. Yeah. But so the Highlanders repelled this cavalry charge. And the British cavalry in the Crimean War was divided into the Light Brigade and the Heavy Brigade. The Light Brigade consisted of what was known as light cavalry. There is a lot of interesting debate on classifications of cavalry and what things like hussars and dragoons and lancers and that means. But I will go into that later. The sake of this is light cavalry in this instance are intended for reconnaissance operations, for screening and flank protection, for pursuing a already routed enemy, i.e. they're not going to be that kind of shock cavalry that will break a line. They're going to be cutting down people who are running away, and general sort of assistance to maneuver. They are the eyes and ears of a commander and are pursuing and providing rear guards.
A quick question. Can you tell us kind of the difference in, light cavalry, hussars, dragoons? Maybe what were they mounted on? What were they carrying? And then obviously what their function was.
Absolutely. So there are lots of different names for different types of cavalry. You have hussars, dragoons, lancers, chasseurs, and so on. Generally speaking, in the Napoleonic Wars and the 19th century, the exact name of a regiment will likely delineate what its role is, but there's a lot of difference in that often the exact name of what a regiment is might not necessarily translate into how they're used on the battlefield. For example, a hussar is was influenced by Hungarian cavalry, and their main job is light cavalry. And light cavalry, the main difference between light cavalry and heavy cavalry in this period was light cavalry was not delineated by the armor or the weapons they used, but the size of the horse and the size of the man riding it. In that light cavalry was a lighter, smaller horse with a slightly smaller man on top of it, and heavy cavalry was a heavier horse with a larger man on top of it. So heavy cavalry was designed to be shock troops. They were line breakers. If there was a point where a commander, an astute commander, had acknowledged that there was an enemy force that had not yet formed into square and were left vulnerable with a exposed line, they would send their heavy cavalry in to punch through that line and exploit through the rear. The light cavalry were used as reconnaissance troops. They would patrol forward in front of a campaigning army, remembering that in this period, and especially in the Napoleonic Wars, when a lot of the doctrine of the Crimean War was established, there could be weeks or even months of maneuver before there would be a battle. And so although the light cavalry wouldn't have a major impact on the battle itself while it's happening, they would be instrumental in deciding what would happen in the battle. Yeah. So as an army is advancing, they would be on the flanks protecting it and providing a screen. So they would provide the early warning. They would be patrolling ahead of an advancing army to find where the enemy is and conduct skirmishes to delay an enemy so that the main army might maneuver around. But they were not designed to charge through a line. They were not meant to be like men-at-arms at Agincourt. Heavy cavalry certainly were. But to be specific...
Two sentences. What? Tell us about Agincourt.
Agincourt was, in two sentences, 1415, Henry V proved to the French that the noble men-at-arms of old in plate armour on horses were no longer the biggest player on the battlefield. He proved that low cost for their buck, peasant, longbowmen and infantry could be just as effective as a noble that has trained since birth to fight in a cavalry charge and has got armour worth more than any peasant could ever hope to earn in his entire life. The infantry revolution and the military revolution of the 17th century is a very, very long tangent that I'll happily go into later, but that's effectively what Henry V did, is he used longbowmen to decimate a French cavalry charge, and in doing so, heavy cavalry, that kind of shock cavalry. The French cavalry was, exactly that. The French cavalry was trying to break the English line, exploit the fact that the English had fewer men-at-arms being those heavily armed and armoured knights. The French were trying to exploit the fact they had far more of them than the English did. They tried to charge through it, and the sun was blotted out by English longbow arrows, and almost an entire generation of French aristocracy was killed. Yeah. And if Henry V hadn't have been a bit of a wetter and died of disease, then we probably would have claimed the French crown. But that's another story for another day. Back to what I was saying. So a hussar is almost always light cavalry. My favourite regiment is the 11th Hussars, Prince Albert's own, known as the Cherry Pickers for their bright red trousers. This is the regiment that Harry Flashman was a member of in the series of Flashman novels, which is perhaps my favourite series of books, and that I would suggest for any discerning 19th century enthusiast.
Which I am, on his recommendation, I am in about halfway through the first one, thoroughly enjoying it. So a hussar would be also very much like a Comanche. Its Native American counterpart would be a Comanche. It would be a Lakota from the Oglala, the Miniconjou, the Hunkpapa, all those, like I said, Comanche, Northern Cheyenne, Arapaho. Very light. You have bows and arrows, hand-to-hand weapons, and you're at a distance. You might close quickly, but then you'll retreat intentionally. But you would never, or almost never, do a full-on charge to try and break through a line. That just wouldn't happen with hussar-style cavalry. That's fascinating. I didn't realize it was the the weight of the horse and rider. I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, so hussars are my favourite kind of cavalry, partly because I just love that regiment, and I think they have the best-looking uniforms. That what's known as a Busby cap or hat is this sort of cylindrical fur hat, and they often traditionally wear their outer jackets with only one arm in the sleeve, which just looks pretty cool. So then you might also have dragoons. Dragoons are intended, when they were first envisaged, they were intended to be mounted infantry, i.e. they were armed with a slightly shorter carbine as opposed to a full-length rifle to allow them to easily transport it on a horse. And their main job was to be mounted infantry. It was envisaged that they would use the mobility of a horse to ride quickly up to wherever an engagement was happening, dismount, and then fight as infantry. However, this rarely ever happened outside of maybe some instances in Spain, but certainly did not happen at Waterloo or in the Crimean War. They were effectively used as heavy cavalry. They, of course, were also armed with sabres. Then lancers, these were the other ones. They would wear these, what were known as mortarboard hats, almost like what you might wear at a university, not college, graduation, with the flat top, and they would carry lances, basically a spear. Interestingly, Kaiser Wilhelm II, my most hated European monarch of the 19th century, was fascinated by lancers, and he insisted that every single German cavalry unit should be turned into a lancer unit. They were effective at skewering an enemy with their lance. Again, these were part of the Light Brigade in the Battle of Balaclava. But anyway, so we're back to the 92nd Highlanders had bravely repelled this advance of barbarous Cossack cavalry. And to exploit this, the Heavy Brigade, the 2nd Brigade of the British Cavalry in this battle, had also defied doctrinal thinking, and where normally you would only charge cavalry against an exposed enemy, ideally downhill, they decided, or their commander decided, to charge gallantly uphill onto the redoubts in between the north and southern valley of Balaclava. And despite all doctrinal thinking, they were incredibly successful, and they completely routed the Russian Cossack cavalry. There were some reports of people saying that the casualty statistics for the Russians were far lower than it should have been. Some people suggested that it's because the Russian winter tunics were far thicker than normal, and so their sabres didn't cut through them. That's only a rumour, but I would like to say yes, it's not because of anything else, it's because the bloody Russians didn't play fair. Anyway, so the Russians, their cavalry had retreated, and to set the scene of what the battle looked like, you had two valleys. In between them was a set of hills, almost like a spur. You had one valley, the North Valley, a set of hills, and then the South Valley. The 92nd Highlanders and the Heavy Brigade had prevented the Russians from advancing into the South Valley. At the west side of the North Valley was the Light Brigade, with Lord Lucan, or Lucon, as I like to call him, and a lot of people at the time did. They're sitting there, again, he's not taking the initiative, and he's not seeing what's going on in the battle. He obviously has not positioned himself in a good position to see what's going on in the battle. All he can see are the mouths of the valley, and he can see a Russian battery, a fearsome Russian battery at the end of the North Valley. Now, after the Cossacks had been routed, as they were retreating, Lord Raglan on the I believe it's Soporn Heights, where he was on the west end of the two valleys, so he could see easily the entirety of the North Valley, the South Valley, and importantly, the heights between the two. This was where the Ottoman forts... Oh, yes, it is. So, we have here... This was... Yeah.
Let's see. Can you see? I don't know if you can see very well.
Yeah, so this here is the set of heights between the two valleys. North Valley here, South Valley here, and you have Raglan, the commander of British forces, sitting just here. Raglan can easily see this mean-looking Russian artillery battery, and he can see what happened here and where the Cossacks were retreating back over these hills. And he could also see how these redoubts, which I mentioned that the Turks had been overran in earlier, the Russians were just starting, or the Cossacks, after they withdrew, were starting to tow away the British guns in these forts. And he was seeing this and thinking, oh Christ, I don't want the Russians to take my guns. But Raglan was, I would say, not a very good commander. He was not a particularly decisive man like Wellington was. He did not know, or if he did not know, he was not confident enough to seize the initiative as he should had. He was sitting in his command post at the Northern Heights, the Soporn Heights, with his staff officers, deliberating what he should do. He was lamenting how Lucan was not seizing the initiative. But he was also thinking, well, okay, maybe Lucan isn't advancing because he was waiting for the infantry under Cambridge to advance up. Perhaps Lucan wanted to wait for the infantry to advance on a more combined arms kind of attack. But either way, Raglan wasn't sure what to do. However, Raglan had been in the Napoleonic Wars as a young man and revered Lord Wellington like a god. And the rumour is that one of his staff officers mentioned offhand, well, Lord Wellington never lost a gun, which is true. Wellington never lost a gun in Spain. And so Raglan, in his staff office, was thinking, oh Christ, I can't lose a bloody gun. So he had a bit of a flap, and he's flapping off like his...
What does that mean to an American?
Oh, to an American, having a flap is like having a bit of a... he's very worried, sort of not sure what to do, indecisive, crisis of confidence, like, oh my God, what do I do? He's worrying a lot. He's flapping enough that he's about to take off. And so he's worried about these guns being taken away. And perhaps it's because he was a poor commander, or perhaps he was just didn't take that sort of deep breath moment to think what was going on. All in his mind he is thinking is, oh God, I've got to stop the Russians from taking these guns away. And so he instructs his brigadier, I can't remember the name of him, but his basically second in command, to write down his order. And I believe I have it here, where he says, so he dictates an order. The order reads, Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry on your left. Immediate. R. Airy. Airy was the name of his brigadier who dictated his order. So, for any of you that are in the military, you might understand that there's quite an extensive orders process. I would argue this doesn't meet that standard. It's quite vague, quite rash, and very open to interpretation, because what the front means certainly depends on where you're standing. From Raglan's perspective, to him, the front was obviously these redoubts, these formerly Turkish redoubts on the hills between the North and Southern Valley. However, he dispatched this order. Who did he give this order to? Well, Captain Louis Nolan. Nolan was a rather junior captain, but he was a very, very intelligent man who was very interested and was quite a bit of a writer on cavalry doctrine. He was the kind of man that thought that cavalry was a battle winner. He had spent all the time since the Battle of Alma lamenting Lord Lookon for his failure to seize the initiative, and was constantly trying to say, cavalry wins battles, use the cavalry, charge, win the battle. And so Raglan gave his perhaps most necky staff officer this message to deliver.
Okay, what does necky mean?
Necky means very willing to speak above your station, very willing to criticize someone that may well be more senior to him. He was probably a very intelligent man, but as also a junior man, as is in the British Army, it is not becoming to speak to your superiors, even if you know best. But so the reason I'm saying this is because I want you to understand what Nolan was thinking. He's been sitting on these heights with Raglan, seeing him deliberate for however long. But in his mind, the solution has been clear since the start, since the Cossacks had been routed. It was so obvious to him, and I would agree, that the cavalry should immediately charge to recapture these redoubts, secure the guns, and prevent the Russian advance on Balaclava. But as any of you who may well have had a boss who doesn't want to listen, or more senior than you and you can't say anything, know, he couldn't say anything to Raglan. He couldn't tell Raglan, well, he may well have perhaps tried, but he couldn't give the order himself. But once Raglan had finally decided to order the cavalry to charge, bearing in mind, in Nolan's opinion, Lucan should have taken the initiative and done it without an order himself. But anyway, now Raglan has given this order on paper, has given it to Nolan, given him the verbal confirmation, which Nolan would then read back to Raglan to ensure it's the right order. Nolan rides like the clappers towards Lord Lucan and the cavalry.
Clappers are the warriors.
Oh, no, ride like the clappers means very quickly.
What does clappers mean?
Ride like the clappers means ride very quickly. Okay. I apologize.
I'm creating our own little lexicon here, you know? Okay, thank you.
Anyway, so Nolan rides very quickly towards Lord Lucan. So Lucan, as I might have mentioned, was the commander of the entire British cavalry force. But at this point, the Heavy Brigade had disengaged and they were not part of this formation. And it was the Light Brigade that had been yet to be employed. Again, the light cavalry consisting of hussars and lancers that I talked about previously. Now, the commander of the Light Brigade was Lord Cardigan, who happened to be brother-in-law to Lord Lucan, much to his disdain. They did not like each other. So Nolan rides up towards Lucan and Cardigan, and he gives them this order. And so from Lucan's position at the base of this valley, he could not see these redoubts that Raglan intended him to retake. And he's deliberating with Cardigan. Cardigan's speaking, what do you mean? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? We've got to attack, but where? What does this order mean? Both of them are sort of, what do we do? Nolan sees this, and he sees the two bickering, and again, in his frustration, because again, in his mind, Lucan should have ordered Cardigan to charge hours ago. And he's sitting there like any necky captain would, seeing a flag officer not doing his job properly, as many did in the 19th century. And he's thinking, in his mind, Christ, why are you not moving yet? And Lucan says to him, basically asking him what was probably a rude way for clarification for this order. And this was the fateful reply. In his frustration, because for hours Nolan has been seething, foaming at the mouth for the cavalry to charge. And as he's finally got there and they're not doing what he thinks he's telling them to do, he famously goes, waves his arm like this, vaguely to the east, and goes, "There, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns." But of course, the only guns within eyeshot of Lucan, because the intended target was on a hill that he couldn't see, the only target that he could see was this large Russian battery at the east end of a valley flanked by Russian infantry and cavalry. And so Lucan, again, conferred with Cardigan and was like, this is stupid. This is a very bad idea. But for whatever reason, didn't properly clarify with Nolan. And despite them thinking it was a stupid idea, them being British officers who do what they're told, started to trot towards this Russian battery. As the poem goes, I'm sure you can interpret what happened. They, as soon as they started to advance, Russian shells started bursting above them. And as they were going in the wrong direction, Nolan started to realise his mistake. And he started to realise perhaps he was a bit of an arrogant so-and-so that should have maybe used the emotional intelligence to understand that perhaps these two lords didn't understand exactly what he was saying. And as the Light Brigade was advancing on a suicide charge, well, at least what it seemed like, he broke formation and rode directly towards Cardigan, screaming, "Wheel right! Wheel right!" because they wanted to go up the hills towards their right, but they were charging directly east. But before Cardigan could take any notice of him, a Russian shell bursted above his head and killed him. Nolan died. And so the Light Brigade was left to continue their trot, which, under increasing Russian artillery and musket fire, eventually broke to a canter and then a gallop. They continued on bravely up this canyon or this valley, suffering severe casualties. However, they got to the Russian guns at the end of the battery, or at the end of the valley, cut down the gunners, and seized the ground. They had managed to make it to the end of the valley. They had, however, suffered 1/3 casualties of, I think, 670. They lost over 130. It was a third dead or wounded or captured.
The makeup of the composition of the Russians, obviously it was artillery. Was there infantry up front? Was there other cavalry?
They had infantry supporting the guns on the north and east. So they were getting peppered by musket fire as well as artillery. But it wasn't like a thick line of infantry. It would be skirmish lines to support the guns. But so the Light Brigade did reach the end of the valley, and they had secured their place at the end of this valley, despite their high casualties. Now, if they had been supported by infantry, they may well have been able to secure their position. However, that large force of Cossacks, which the Heavy Brigade had unfortunately had been unable to completely neutralise, was laying just east of this gun battery. And so the Light Brigade knew that if they stayed there for much longer, they may well be overrun. So they retreated. Interestingly, the rumour goes that Cardigan retreated somewhat sooner than the rest of his regiment, which may be why he survived the battle. As a Navy captain may well have gone down with his ship, Cardigan certainly didn't. It also helped... so this was quite a Pyrrhic victory. They may well have reached the end of the valley. They may well have killed plenty of Russian soldiers, but they achieved, sadly, nothing of note. This didn't apply any tactical or operational benefits to this battle. I would argue that once the Cossack charge had been halted by the 92nd and then pushed back by the Heavy Brigade, the Battle of Balaclava was effectively over, because that had stopped the Russians from advancing any further into Balaclava. But anyway, the Light Brigade conducted and then withdrew from this charge. And after the war, I can't remember who died and when, but I know within a year of the war ending, Raglan and Lucan were dead. Nolan had been killed in the charge, and Cardigan was the only man to tell this story. So naturally, he got promoted. Of course he did. I mean, why would he not? He's an officer and a gentleman and led a cavalry charge. Don't talk about the fact that he left before the rest of his men. That's beside the point. Yeah, so it went down as a very infamous operation. It was quite a Pyrrhic victory, and then, of course, Alfred Lord Tennyson immortalised it in poetry. Although Cardigan himself may well have been promoted and did well over the charge for his apparent gallantry in doing it, the Crimean War, and particularly the Light Brigade charge, did hit home for the British public, because up until this point, if you had enough money, you could buy a commission. All it took was money, and you could get promoted. It was literally a military rank was a commodity. You could buy it and sell it once you got it. The Crimean War, on the backlash of it, and especially because of the charge of the Light Brigade, like the military thinkers who were in the know about this kind of thing would have probably seen what happened in the war at large and would have come to the same conclusions. But because of the charge of the Light Brigade and how infamous it was and how this resonated with the public, there was, much more political pressure to reform the army. And this eventually led to the Cardwell reforms. I can't remember exactly what year that was, but that effectively ended the system of purchase for commissions. That was, I think it was about a decade after the war. I can't exactly remember.
Merit-based. Somewhat, perhaps.
It stopped people buying. Yeah, on paper it stopped it being merit. On paper it made it merit-based. Effectively, all it did was stop people buying commissions, which was certainly a step in the right direction. And so, yeah, it did help for plenty of reforms, and it led the way to the Childers reforms and whatnot, which were other things. But basically, it was a key step in how the British Army changed from the Army of Waterloo to the Army of Loos or the Somme.
That's fantastic. Okay, so that was amazing. Thank you. A follow-up question would be, and this might be a whole other podcast, but one of my favorite time periods to study, and I love British history, English and British history, is the American Revolution, obviously. But I mean, I'm not not one of those that's like, history didn't start till July the 4th. So, yeah, I truly love and respect British history. But Cornwallis is General Howe at Bunker Hill, I mean, is one of the greatest, I think one of the greatest paragons of manhood. You're going to go up a hill 3 times. Your uniform is purple with other people's blood, and you're unscathed, and yet you keep going up the hill. That's amazing. That's awesome. The American Revolution, one of the great dragoon officers was Banastre Tarleton.
I've not heard that name.
Okay, so this will be for the next one then. Mm-hmm. So we're going to do this again, hopefully, if you can. Banastre Tarleton was a young aristocrat of minor aristocracy who was such a lack of a better word, a jackass. I mean, as far as morally, you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. He wasn't a good Christian boy.
A flashman type.
A flashman, yes. That his dad basically bought Coronet. Is that what was the first one?
Yeah, I believe.
So this would have been 1770s.
I may be wrong, but I believe Cornet was the rank below second lieutenant for the cavalry.
Okay.
And subaltern was the rank below second lieutenant for the infantry. Nowadays, subaltern refers to second lieutenant, lieutenant, and captain.
Okay. So this would have been 1770s. His dad purchased a commission in the British Army. He went over to the colonies as early 20s, I think. Mm-hmm. So he's a young guy. And he serves up in the north with, I think, General Henry Clinton. Mm-hmm. Well, then he comes south in 1780, and he's under Cornwallis, who, interestingly enough, made all of his mistakes in the colonies. And then when he went to India and he fought in the Tipu Saib rebellion, he put it down and became viceroy. Like he learned all his mistakes. I really respect Cornwallis for that. Also, great leadership. He was this would have been in the South Carolinian woods when he realized, you know what, we might have to get up here to try and get the Navy to support us. He said, everybody put everything in a pile that you don't need. And he put several of his own coats. He put several of his own books, which on the trail would have been very, very valuable, more so than now. And he started the pile with his own personal belongings. I think that's great leadership. He wasn't like, hey, y'all put your stuff in the pile. He started the pile with his own belongings, and then they burnt it, and then so they could travel light and fast, and they left and fled and ended up at Yorktown. But he ended up as Viceroy of India. Anyway, Banastre Tarleton was ruthless by American standards. So I would love for you to go and read up on Banastre Tarleton. I would love to hear what your thoughts are.
Absolutely.
Because in South Carolina standards, he was ruthless at the Battle of Waxhaws, supposedly, and depends on who's telling the story. There was American infantry that surrendered. Well, he rode through them and sabred a lot of them. These surrendering men who had thrown down their weapons. They mention it in the Patriot, which we know how historically accurate that is. And yet, that was a real event. In Tarleton, he wrote a memoir after the war, and he said, I was too far out of range. I did not give that order. I actually stopped it from being worse. Like that, and to me, that's plausible. I haven't read the memoir.
It's a really interesting thing to talk about on the differing accounts of how a battle will turn out. So, with my close friend Garrett Jones, who I know you know, I helped from a small extent. I helped with the research for our book, D-Day: The Unheard Tapes. Of course, I got to plug the book at some point.
Please do that very quickly, if you would.
Yeah. So Garrett wrote, and I helped research a book called D-Day: The Unheard Tapes. What it is a basically we had seen, well, Gez had first seen, and I bought into his vision that any sort of history books about a campaign, bearing in mind I love books about generals and officers. However, the vast majority of books that will cover the D-Day campaign and the Normandy campaign at large are about what is Montgomery doing, what is Eisenhower thinking, what is this brigade commander doing, and how did this army move. What there appeared to be quite a gap in was, what is Private so-and-so doing? How does he feel? What is his reaction to getting shelled or landing on the beaches at Sword, Gold, Juneau, Utah, or Omaha? And so what we found was a large archive from the Imperial War Museums of interviews from various veterans from the D-Day and Normandy campaign that had been conducted in, I think, the 80s and 90s. These interviews of their entire experiences for the campaign that are, although released, effectively not available to the public. Certainly, if you didn't know to look for them, you wouldn't hear about them. So what we endeavoured to do was get these interviews onto paper and use these interviews to tell the narrative of D-Day and the Normandy campaign. Our aim is, and bearing in mind, so I did a history degree at university, and I'm certainly woefully experienced in writing the kind of academic essays that I know all too well will bore and annoy a normal person. And this is what we both agreed, me and Geraint, was that history shouldn't be exclusively for the academics. History is for everyone. And you can see plenty of books, like a certain chap wrote about the 53rd Welsh Division, that just academic essays that are not amenable to normal people. So our hope was that if a normal person who had never read an academic essay and had never read about the Normandy campaign or D-Day before could pick up our book, and when finishing it, and I say our book, I just have to say it's like Gez did almost all the writing, and I just did a lot of the research. He did a lot of the research as well. I have to be quite humble in this because he's given me a very good deal. I'm very lucky to be working on this book with him. Shout out Gez. Anyway, our aim is that someone who has never read anything about this kind of history before could pick up, I will say, our book, and then they may not understand exactly what division went where. They might not know exactly how many troops landed wherever. Although, they might not know the strategic, operational, and tactical implications of an action. They might even know what an SMLE Mark IV No. 1 rifle is. But they will know what it was like to be an average soldier to land on Sword, Gold, Juneau, Utah, Omaha Beach, or even Pointe du Hoc, which was a separate beach. That's the hope, is that you could not know anything about D-Day, and you could pick up this book, read it on a Sunday afternoon after 18 beers in Benidorm, and having read it, understand what it was like to fight through the hedgerows, or what it was like to fly a Typhoon fighter bomber over Normandy, or the emotions going through someone's head when they were confronted by 4 Germans trying to surrender. And I think that is one thing that I really think is important, because academia as a whole is so insular. I love history. I hate academia. Doing a history degree really turned me off to history academics. I won't go on too much of a tirade, but I think we have lost the sort of idea of what history is for. The study of history should be learning about, in my opinion, what happened, why did it happen, who was there, what did they feel when they were there. I think too much of the discipline of history now is taken up by academics who try to sort of justify their research and make themselves seem more clever than they are by making their history exclusive. If you make I genuinely think the mark of an intelligent person, or at least the mark of someone who understands what they're talking about, is if you can't explain something that you know a lot about to a 6-year-old, you don't know it well enough. Because to really understand something, you also have to understand its basis principles. And this is one thing that I really take issue with academics nowadays, is that they put out so many essays that are in this exclusionary academic language that the average person not only couldn't possibly read, but has no access to, because you've got to pay £40 or $60 for it. And so that might be a bit of a tangent, but basically our book was a way of trying to make history available to the average person, because I think understanding what the average person went through in that monumentous campaign is far more valuable, really, as much as I love to study what generals do and the operational, tactical and strategic areas of warfare. I also understand that the average person doesn't give a toss about that. And if you're a normal person reading a book, it's far more valuable to find out what Rifleman Tommy felt fighting through Sword Beach and the hedgerows of Normandy or the buildings of Caen.
You've been listening to The Cultured Bumpkin, a literature podcast with Jake Phillips. Thank you very much for listening. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, would you mind going and subscribing and leaving a nice review on whatever podcast platform you heard this on? I would really appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.